Namaskar, everybody. I'm following two wonderful speeches. Just one point comes to mind. Vishwalaji, you talked about whatever system one might have, you have complications which were used by Vyasa. And this is also a part of any system of logic. There are always paradoxes. And you can never remove those paradoxes, like the Bhartrihari paradox, for example, or the statement in Ishavasya Upanishad that Paroksha Priya Ivhi Devaha, the Devas love what is paradoxical. So it's very, very interesting. But as to my talk, um, I don't have enough time. In fact, we're going to be over 9 o'clock very quickly. So I will try to be as brief and maybe say just a few things. I wish to speak on the application of the idea of tattvas, which we don't normally hear scientists mention, excepting perhaps the greatest, or maybe one of the two greatest physicists of the 20th century, one of the co-founders of quantum mechanics, the Vedantin named Erwin Schrödinger, wrote a famous essay where he said, this is about 50, 60 years ago, he said, look, what people are trying to do to solve the fundamental problem of consciousness cannot be solved unless you use tattvas. In other words, he was using the Sankhyan system. That if you're only considering physics, the four elements or five elements of Plato or four elements of Aristotle, there is a limit beyond which you can't go. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is that we stand at the threshold of what is going to be the most extraordinary time in human history. It's expected that just as in the last 200 years, the world population went up from 1 billion in 1800 to about 8 billion now. It's expected that in another 200 years, the world population would have gone down to only 250 million. And there is another demographic institute in Copenhagen, according to which in 2200, 2300, it might be as little as 100 million. So we are going to be looking at the most amazing, astonishing changes that are going to take place in history. And as these changes are taking place, as you know, population of many countries in Asia and Europe is falling, which is why Europe and North America, they're letting in a lot of illegal immigrants in, because one of the measures of the power of a country is the number of people that there are. So this is one reason, if you don't understand what's happening, this is one of the factors. Okay, so this is one side. Changes, scary, as far as society is concerned. The other is the state of knowledge itself. As you know, physics, which is the most basic science, now can explain only 0.5% of the universe. If you look at cosmology, 96% is traced to or is accounted for in terms of dark matter and dark energy, for which there is no evidence whatsoever. That is 96%. And 3.5% is interstellar dust. That is 99.5%. So what you can explain is only 0.5%. Now that's one problem. You look at biology or medicine, there's this famous paper that I would encourage you to look up by John Ioannidis, who is a professor of medicine at Stanford University. And this paper is called How Literally All Medical Research is False. Something like this. That's because about 70 to 80% of all clinical research cannot be reproduced. This is called the replication or the reproducibility crisis of medicine. So why is all this happening? Why do we have this crisis in physics, and why do we have this crisis in medicine, and psychology as well. That's because, in my view, we are not, and I would think, I would imagine that Schrodinger would agree, we are not taking all the tattvas into consideration. And I will speak of two of those. Well, it's easy to speak about earth, air, water, and fire, but Akash, Akash, which used to be translated as ether once upon a time before theory of relativity, now it is just called space, and that's how it's seen in physics itself. But that is problematic. And in fact, what happened was 5, 6 years ago, I was invited by a conference, a very well-known conference series. It's called International Conference on Multiple Valued Logic, which has been going on for 60, 70 years. So they invited me to their main conference in Vienna. They said, would you speak on your research on neural networks? I said, okay. But then I said, well, let me look up what this multiple valued logic is. And I was astonished to discover, first of all, that binary logic is not optimal. Ternary logic is, meaning logic in three categories. And as you know, Ayurveda is ternary logic, allopathy is binary logic. So I was truly astonished. And then I discovered that even ternary logic is not optimal. If you consider real numbers, then E is optimal. E means 2.718, Euler's number. 2.718 is optimal. So, well, I went to Vienna. I hadn't been there for some time. I liked it. Then, when the pandemic broke in 2020, I was stuck in my daughter's house in Miami, and we couldn't go very far. Of course, Miami was much more relaxed than many other parts of the US. But tossing and turning in the bed one night, the idea came to me, what if this whole idea, because nature is optimal, if 3 is not optimal and E is optimal, what if this notion that we have that space is three-dimensional is wrong? Because it's just a convention. It goes back to Descartes, and then Newton and Einstein. Einstein, three-dimensional but sort of curved, but a three. So I said, well, what if this is not right? What if space is three-dimensional? And we give it a three-dimensional gloss. And I used that. I looked up Scientific American. There was, in June of 2020, a long article, this great puzzle or riddle of cosmology that they can't explain, two different rates at which the space is expanding. And I discovered that you could solve that in a minute. I wrote up an article for Nature. They accepted it. They published it. And then after that, I was able to write a whole series of articles where if you accept this proposition that space is not three-dimensional, but e-dimensional, but of course we view it as three-dimensional, then you don't need to appeal to dark matter and dark energy. They go away. And then you can explain that while the universe is accelerating right now, this acceleration will slow down and eventually come back, as is the Vedantic idea. You read it in the Mahabharata or Vedanga Jyotish, not Vedanga Jyotish, in Yoga Vasishta. There is a huge passage on this, how pralaya takes place, how sun will become bigger and the earth will dissolve into the Apas Tattva. Apas will dissolve into Tejas, then it will all dissolve into Vayu, and then it will be absorbed into the Chetana, of Vishnu or whatever else. So it all goes away, which is sort of interesting. So I've written a whole series of papers. They've all been accepted, no pushback, which doesn't mean that the whole physics community has embraced it. In physics, they have all kinds of bizarre theories, such as time is going backwards, so you're going through a wormhole into backwards, etc. So right now, it's out there. But then 2 years ago, the thought came to me, and this is also very interesting from the perspective of where do thoughts come from? Where does creativity come from? Because so long as we are within the box, you can't be creative. And if you look at the stories of all of people, not just Srinivas Ramanujan, but also Elias Howe, who invented the sewing machine, in the 1740s. Everybody was trying to invent the sewing machine, and he had a vision. He saw that some Indians, not us Indians, but some Indians were going to cannibals. They were going to cook him. So they were dragging him into a big cauldron where they were going to cook him. And then from the corner of his eye, he found some Indians with a spear which had an eye in it, which had a hole in it. And at that moment, he woke up. He's probably dozing at his desk, which is what professors do most of the time when nobody's watching them. So immediately woke up, he realized that was the solution. He needed a needle with an eye, which is what you have in a sewing machine. Or you have the story of Kekule, who saw in one of those reveries 6 snakes, with each holding the tail of the other as the solution to the benzene structure, because that was one of the big problems in 1850, and that's where it was. So I've had many of these, including my discovery of the structure of Rig Veda. I was actually reading John Updike. I was reading the New Yorker, 1993, and this essay, Updike says, isn't it amazing that looking from the Earth, the size of the sun and the moon is about the same? The moment I read it, something happened to me. This whole overpowering idea came to me that this has something to do with the structure of the Rig Veda. I rushed to my library, I opened up the Rig Veda book, look at the organization, and indeed, this number is fundamental to the way Rig Veda, in 10 mandalas, and some mandalas are 191, suktas like the first and the 10th, some are 43, 118, etc., etc. All of that can be explained if you assume that the Vedic rishis knew that, first of all, that the sun and the moon are each 108 times their respective diameter from the Earth, and many, many other things, on which then in the mid-90s I wrote a book called the Astronomical Code of the Vedic Veda. So that's where it came from. Not from me, I was just a medium, right? So 2 years ago, again, I come back from Miami. We visit there all the time because both my children live there. So I had gone to my office, and the idea came to me, which had never come to me before. Okay, e-dimensional universe seems to be effective as far as the physical cosmos is concerned. But what about our inner cosmos, the genetic code? Now, genetic code was discovered in the 1960s, and a huge amount of paper, tens of thousands of papers, all of medicine is transformed. And in the genetic code, you have codons. You have, you have the 4 bases, and the code word is 3 bases long. So 4 to the power 364, and they map into 20 amino acids. 64 codons map into 20 amino acids. If you were an engineer, if God was an engineer, I'm not using the traditional sense of the word God. If God is an engineer, he would assign 3 codons to each amino acid for maximal error correction, right? 64, 3 of them are stop signs. 61 by 20 is 3. So it assigns 3. But there are many amino acids which have 6 codons, and there are many amino acids which have only 1 codon, which is not optimal at all. But if you assume that biological information is also governed by an e-dimensional logic, the exact distribution drops out or comes out. So just to conclude, I think this idea of Akasha, of course, here in physics and biology could help medicine and physics proceed forward. And also, the other field, of course, is the tattva of Purush itself, or consciousness, which is in neurosciences or in physics or computer science is considered the frontier of science. Why? Because if you knew what the secret of consciousness was, you could program a computer to be a conscious machine. And if it could be done, it will be done in the future. And if it is done in the future, if you had conscious AI machines, they'll take over the world. They will say, oh, these pesky little creatures, they have so much of trouble, they are very unhappy. as you said, humans are very unhappy. They say, get rid of them and we'll do this. But fortunately, recently there's been a paper which shows that computers will never be conscious because consciousness has an aspect to it which is transcendent. So it can never be a property of any material thing. And in fact, the proof of it is very, very simple. Hardware is equivalent to software. If you constructed a machine which was conscious, you could also write it down as a program. So this would then mean that this mathematical equation itself is equivalent to consciousness, which seems ridiculous. Another proof, very simple. If you had a computer of sufficient complexity, which was conscious, this machine could be subpart of another machine which has even more complexity. Then this conscious machine could have subparts which are all conscious, which is ridiculous, which is not possible, right? Which is incorrect. So, which means that consciousness is one, right? Which is, of course, which is all what Vedanta is all about. If you read, the Brahma Sutras, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the whole idea is that the Atman is not a property of the body. So, in any event, just to conclude, there are so many different ways right now, whether you're doing hardcore physics, hardcore biology, as in genetics or in medicine, or psychology. I think these notions that we have in Sankhya, especially Akasha, which immediately goes to physics, as we've seen, and Purusha, of course, the whole idea of consciousness and machines, and where does that come in, opens up whole new worlds. So we are not just talking philosophy or texts, Sanskrit texts, and studying them, which is, of course, a very important thing we need to continue doing. But we are actually speaking of building bridges with science of different kinds. I think in that sense, it's not only because as everybody knows, the 21st century is supposed to be India's century, because as the population of other nations collapses, I don't know how many of you know that in 2100, China's population is expected to be one third of what it is now, maybe only 500 million people. India's population will also start falling in 20 years, but for another 20 years, India has a sweet spot, and India's total economy is expected to overtake both China's and the US, according to Goldman Sachs, in the next 40, 50 years. So India will not only exercise a lot of influence in the worldly affairs, economics, etc. But as Indians become more self-confident, they would also play a very important role in transforming society everywhere. In fact, I go as far as to proclaim that the 21st century is going to be the century of Sanatana Dharma. And we should stand up because this is universal. Why should we be diffident and say, hey, it's only a way of life? We're not talking of way of life, we're talking of eternal truths which apply to everybody all over the world. And if we proclaim it with confidence, people will listen, because most people, just like every creature loves sunrise, sunset, even nothing as wonderful and beautiful as the Sanatana tradition. So perhaps HUA and waves would play a bigger role.